welcome back to another episode of Ask Forza. The Derby is in the books. Mage is your victor. We had scratches left, right, and center all week long. It was a very interesting week overall. We wanted to touch on something that maybe not too many people know about, which is why, at least what was released in the press as to why Forte scratched and what are some of the things with that. So we wanted to talk about a bruised foot and what that means, and how shoeing can come into play in terms of helping that horse out. So on the morning of the Kentucky Derby, Forte was a scratch, and it was reported that it was due to a hoof bruise. So what we wanted to do is jump into what a hoof bruise is, how you can deal with it. A horse can bruise his hoof in many different places. There's a ton of different shoeing jobs. We're going to specifically talk about Forte in this scenario, but I wanted to toss it over to the lovely veterinarian here to kind of discuss what a hoof bruise is.
So with a hoof bruise, it can occur anywhere on the foot. It can occur at the toe, on the frog, the quarters, the sole. It all depends on where the trauma is. Most people, when they think of a hoof, they think of the hard outer portion. But inside there's a lot of vascular tissue with a lot of blood vessels. So when that area receives a trauma, it bleeds and those blood vessels break, creates a focal bruise. There's heat, there's pain. Unfortunately, most of the time with this, it does come down to rest, time, anti-inflammatory medication, but most of the treatment is focused on alleviating the pressure in the area where the bruise is and protecting the bruised area. A lot of bruises in racehorses specifically occur because they do tend to be thin-soled, and they do tend to have flatter feet, so they are more likely to come into contact with a stone just because of the way their feet are made. But just being thinner-soled does predispose them to having more of a trauma to the foot if they do step on something. Throwing that into the mix is also the fact of a bad farrier job. If a farrier shoes a horse improperly and creates an imbalance and puts too much pressure on one area of the foot, that again will create a bruise.
So with that, and continuing onwards, also if a farrier cuts a horse a little bit too short, not to where it gets it in the sensitive area, but thins out that sole too much or thins out an area too much, it can also lead to a bruise. So as Dominique mentioned, it's timing on how you treat these things. If it's a bruise that's close on a race, you can look at different ways. So a lot of times you'll hear people hot tubbing a horse and you're trying to pull out that bruise and pull out that pain, and you're trying to soak the foot to try and remove the pain that's actually in the foot. What can happen in that scenario is it softens the foot. So it doesn't allow the foot to be hard to then go on and do something like a gallop in the morning and expect that there's not a ton of pain in that hoof. So sometimes when you're close to a race, you go to icing the foot because you're trying to help just at least alleviate some of the pain and pressure in that hoof while not softening that hoof up too much with hot water. So timing with these horses when these things happen is a huge thing. Obviously, it seems like they were up against the wall with it because they were so close to the Kentucky Derby. And when you're dealing with a 3-year-old colt and he's at the peak of fitness, there's not a whole lot of time that you can do to give him off the racetrack without him busting out of his skin. And even if they got him right and walked him 3 days and that got him sound, there's a good chance that when he ran, it would have bothered him. So it sounds like what they did is they 3/4'd the shoe because it was in the heel. And I'm not sure if it was medial heel or lateral heel, but it was in the heel. So when you think of a shoe, it's a horseshoe. You 3/4 a portion of it, meaning you remove it. So you only are left with 3/4 of that shoe on that horse. And the whole point in that is the other 3/4 of the shoe should be where the horse is loading their weight primarily. And you're hoping that with that kind of 3/4 of a centimeter to a 1/2 centimeter thickness of that shoe, that by alleviating that portion of the shoe, you're lessening the pressure put on that bruise. So it's going to release some of that pain that's caused. Now, here's the problem when you're training on a dirt track and when you're training on a deep dirt track, okay? You've now taken away anything that could protect that heel. So yes, it's going to alleviate pain and pressure when a horse is on a hard, flat surface because it's not going to touch the ground. but when they gallop on a dirt track or train on a dirt track, that dirt compacts, and as it compacts, it's still going to pound on that heel bulb. So the only option in the scenario of Forte would have been to, obviously what they did was scratch him and give him rest to allow it to recover. Now it's a great way to have a horse recover, and I've seen 3/4 chews work, but the problem with 3/4 chews is it's time. There wasn't enough time for them to get that horse back to 100% before the day of the race. So the most obvious thing, obviously, is we're in horse racing, thank God, now focusing more on equine welfare and safety, was to scratch the horse and give him time for that to heal.
Some other options besides 3/4ing the shoe would be to actually kind of do the opposite and put a bar shoe on. So just say you have a bruise along the heels and you put a bar shoe, that's a piece of steel actually covering the heels to protect them from the concussion. So it's kind of counterintuitive, and it all depends on each injury, each horse, but you can treat it with the opposite shoe as well.
Well, and there's a ton of different ways. I mean, Dominique mentioned a bar shoe. So a bar shoe basically puts a bar along the back, and there's different types of bar shoes that are built. You can also put a metal plate across the back and have the farrier create it. What you're trying to do is spread the concussion around the entire foot instead of just trying to balance it on a different thing. So the whole point is to take concussion and balance it in different areas to remove that pressure from that focal point on the hoof. So by creating a bar shoe, you're creating a little bit more stability in that shoe structure to where hopefully it's not going to pound on that hoof. The other thing that Dominique mentioned previously is a pad. Polyurethane pads can be put in shoes. Actually, one that I've seen that's super effective is actually a leather pad, and you put that in between the shoe, and sometimes you still do a combination of the both. You put a bar shoe to help, kind of help with that concussion and dissipate it throughout the entire shoe, and then you put the pad to alleviate that concussion as it goes into the hoof. So there's a ton of different ways to do it. When you're that close to a race, you don't want to screw around with too many things, because here's the big thing with a racehorse. If you change too much, the small thing that you're hoping to treat, like the hoof and the bruised hoof, could turn into something much more major because you've made a tweak in a shoe that caused the horse to move differently, which could cause any type of injury on these horses. So you're trying to do the least amount of change to help that horse going forward on that tight of a time schedule without doing too much of a change to where it could set that horse back if you did decide him to run. So I know it was difficult to the connections. Obviously, Rapoli looked devastated. Everybody involved seemed devastated that that horse was out, and I think all of us would have loved to see him, but for that horse, I think it's long-term probably much better. He'll come out of this, he'll have enough time to recover, and you'll see that horse sound and competing through the rest of the season, because God forbid, we don't think long-term sometimes in horse racing when we make decisions. You could take a horse that had a foot bruise and the bruise was no big deal, and you ran that horse and he moves and shifts his weight off that leg in a race just for something minor like that, and has a slightly different injury that causes a longer layoff. So
it could even turn into an abscess. A lot of bruises, if you get bacteria up in there, suddenly you're dealing with an abscess and you're looking at several months off. So definitely, while something seems minor like a bruise, they can turn into something that's a lot more problematic.
So this is the key with dealing with anything with racehorses. This is why when they sneeze, they cough, they're elevated temperature, it's a spiral effect. One small thing can turn into a very big thing if you don't back off. So that's usually why in racing, and you'll hear it, the horse spiked a little bit of a temp. Well, spiking a little bit of a temp, like what happened with Practical Move, you could say, you know what, no big deal, horse seems back to normal, run the horse, and the horse gets pneumonia, and then he's out for 4 or 5 months. So anytime with these thoroughbreds, they are, they're durable yet extremely fragile. So every time that you have something small, the best word is to be cautious, back off, give that horse what it needs to get back to 100%, and then move forward. So anyways, we just wanted to touch on that. Thank you for tuning in. Hope you had a fun time watching the Kentucky Derby. It was an incredible race, and hats off to the connections of Mage. I mean, that was just phenomenal to see. So thank you for tuning in again.